In today's session, we will look at the poem The Solitary Reaper by William Wordsworth. This poem is prescribed for the students of BA Part 2, English Literature, Paper 1. The introduction to the poem. The Solitary Reaper is a poem by the English poet William Wordsworth. The poem was inspired by the poet's trip to Scotland in 1803 with his sister Dorothy Wordsworth. It was first published in 1807. In the poem, the speaker tries and fails to describe the song he heard a young woman singing as she cuts grain in a Scottish field. The speaker does not understand the song, and he cannot tell what it was about, nor can he find the language to describe its beauty. He finds that the traditional poetic metaphors for a beautiful song fail him. The poem thus calls implicitly for a new kind of poetry, one that is better able to approximate and describe the pure, unpretentious beauty of the reaper's song. Summary of The Solitary Reaper. Look at her alone in the field, that Scottish girl by herself over there. She is cutting the grain and singing to herself. Stop and listen to her or walk on quietly. She cuts and gathers the grain and sings a sad song. Listen, the deep valley is overflowing with her music. No nightingale ever sang more soothing notes to tired groups of travelers as they rested at an oasis in the Arabian desert. The cuckoo bird never sang with such an affecting voice in the spring, breaking the ocean's silence around the Scottish Isles. Won't anyone tell me what her song is about? Maybe she sings so sadly for old tragedies and ancient battles. Or maybe she sings the song is humbler, about everyday things, the pains and sorrows that everyone endures. Whatever she was singing about, the young woman sang as though her song would never end. I saw her singing while she worked, bending over to cut the wheat with a sickle. सिकल वो औज़ार होता है जिसको हम हसिया कहते हैं, जिसका इस्तेमाल खेतों में धान काटने के लिए किया जाता है. I listened to her without moving, and as I walked on up a hill, I carried her music in my heart, and I still do, long after I stopped hearing it. Now we will take a look at the line-by-line explanation and analysis of the poem The Solitary Reaper. Lines 1 to 4. Behold her single in the field, yon solitary Highland lass, reaping and singing by herself, stop here or gently pass. The first 4 lines of The Solitary Reaper announce the poem's broad themes and introduce the reader to its formal technique. The poem begins with an apostrophe. The speaker addresses the reader directly, commanding them to behold and stop here. The poem is thus an invitation to contemplation. The speaker asks the reader to stand and watch as a Scottish woman, a Highland lass, cuts a field of wheat with a sickle. The speaker uses the present tense throughout these lines. As a result, the reader may feel that they are standing next to the speaker, observing the scene together as it unfolds, listening to the reaper's song. Notably, however, each of the speaker's addresses to the reader are separated from the rest of the line by a caesura. Even as the speaker invites the reader into the poem, he marks the reader's distance from the scene he describes. In these lines, the speaker does not tell the reader much about the lass's song yet, but the form of his poem may give the reader some hints about the song itself. The first four lines of the poem closely approximate a stanza of a ballad. At the time that Wordsworth wrote The Solitary Reaper, the ballad was a folk form in wide use across the British Isles for popular songs and lowbrow verse. Students, the meaning of the word ballad will be given to you later on in this lecture. It was not a highly literary form like the sonnet or heroic couplets. Instead, ballads often used everyday language to tell unpretentious stories of everyday life and love in the countryside and cities. Further, the ballads were often collaboratively authored. One anonymous poet adding a stanza, another rearranging the order of stanzas, a third deleting stanzas or changing the theme or writing new words to the same melody. Scottish poetry also makes prominent use of the ballad in print and in popular song. Indeed, it seems likely that the reaper's song was a ballad or a piece of music emerging from the ballad tradition. Ballads had a standard rhyme scheme and meter, though as a popular form, these standards were rarely strictly upheld in practice. Traditionally, ballads rhyme in an ABCB pattern. The second and fourth lines rhyme, the first and third do not, with alternating lines of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. The first four lines of the Solitary Reaper follow this pattern almost. They do rhyme A, B, C, B, but the first three lines of this poem are in iambic tetrameter, followed by a single line of iambic trimeter. This means that the first four lines of the poem follow the pattern of a ballad, but with an extra foot in line 2, a relatively minor deviation from the standards of a genre, meaning style, whose standards are already loose. The speaker here seems to be imitating the formal dynamics of the reaper's song, in a sense, recreating the reaper's song for the reader. The first stanza of the poem is heavily end stopped. It is enjambed only in lines 1 and 7. This creates a slow contemplative reading experience. The reader is encouraged by the end stops to ponder each line, to dwell on them meditatively. But the speaker also employs a subtle pattern of assonance, particularly on an I sound, to bind together the stanza and keep the reader moving through it. Lines 5 to 8. Alone she cuts and binds the grain and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. In lines 5 to 8, the speaker continues to use apostrophe, commanding the reader to listen to the reaper's song. As he does so, the speaker's subject begins to shift. In the first four lines, he had described the reaper's activities in general terms. She is reaping and she is singing. Here he begins to describe the song itself, a project to which the speaker will dedicate most of the rest of the poem. As the speaker shifts focus, the actual labor that the reaper performs falls away. Though the speaker spends much of the poem trying and failing to describe the reaper's song, he tells the reader very little about the work she performs as she sings the song. The reader does not learn, for instance, what kind of grain she reaps, perhaps barley, which was widely grown in Scotland. Nor does the reader learn much about her relationship with the land she works on. She might be a hired laborer, a farmer's daughter, a widow who owns her own land. These questions are outside the speaker's interest. He focuses on the song itself with a kind of obsession. Even so, the information that the speaker actually provides about the song is surprisingly scanty. The reader learns in these lines that the song is melancholy, sad, and that it is loud enough that the deep valley where she works, the vale profound, is overflowing with the sound. These are rather generic descriptions, uninformative. They emphasize the speaker's position relative to the song. He is observing it from a distance, and as the reader learns later in the poem, that distance is partially cultural. He is a tourist in Scotland. As if reinforcing this cultural and physical distance, the poem's form shifts in lines 5 to 8 away from the first four lines and their close approximation of a ballad's form in both meter and rhyme scheme. In contrast to the ballad form of the first four lines, lines 5 to 8 fall into an elevated rhythm and rhyme scheme. The lines rhyme in a CCDD pattern and are all in iambic tetrameter, a structure that is a close approximation to heroic couplets. Rhyming lines of iambic pentameter, a form that was widely used in the 18th century by learned, scholarly, upper class poets like Alexander Pope. Even though these couplets in the poem aren't quite heroic, they are still far from the humble, everyday tones of a ballad. Though Wordsworth's speaker falls short of full heroic couplets, each line is a foot short of full iambic pentameter required of heroic couplets. The rhythm of that elevated form would no doubt have echoed in the ears of his early readers, well schooled in Pope and his followers. Moreover, iambic tetrameter couplets had, in Wordsworth's day, its own elevated pedigree. It is, for instance, the meter of Andrew Marvell's poem to his coy mistress, one of the most famous of Renaissance poems. In the first four lines, if the first four lines come close to but fall short of the ballad, the next four come close to but fall short of heroic couplets. It feels as though the poem cannot decide whether to affiliate itself with high learned poetry or low popular verse, and so alternates between the two, falling short of both. Lines 9 to 12. No nightingale did ever chaunt more welcome notes to weary bands of travellers in some shady haunt among Arabian sands. In stanzas 2 and 3 of the Solitary Reaper, The speaker repeatedly attempts to describe the reaper's song for the reader and consistently fails to do so. The speaker begins in stanza 2 by comparing her, metaphorically, to a nightingale that is singing to weary travelers in the Arabian desert. The nightingale is an important bird in the history of poetry. It often serves as a symbol for the poet, its beautiful song standing in for beauty of poetry itself. And Arabia is a suggestive location for the nightingale. For an English reader of the early 19th century, it would be a distant and exotic locale. So, in lines 9 to 13, the speaker is measuring the reaper's song against a traditional symbol of poetic beauty and power. And in a sense, the speaker is also measuring the reaper's song against the tradition of poetry itself. As a prominent symbol of poetry's power and as itself a traditional symbol, the nightingale stands in for the traditions of poetry. Further, metaphor is one of the central poetic devices in the history of poetry. After refraining from using it in the first stanza, refraining means avoiding, the speaker does so repeatedly in the second. The reader may suspect then that the speaker is testing metaphor itself, measuring the ability of traditional metaphoric comparisons to describe the reaper's actual song. As it turns out, the speaker states that the metaphor is not strong enough and that no nightingale did ever chaunt as beautifully as the reaper sang. In this respect, the speaker offers the reaper an elegant and moving compliment. As beautiful as the nightingale's song may be, her song is more beautiful, more moving. Her means the reaper's song. As he does so, he also offers an implicit critique of poetry and its historical resources. If the nightingale is a symbol for the poet, then the reaper sings more beautifully than any poet ever did. If the nightingale is a symbol for the historical resources of poetry, then the beauty of her song exceeds those resources, marks their limitations. The poet seems to be asserting that poetry does not have a symbol or metaphor in its repertoire that can express the beauty of the reaper's song. Repertoire can be understood as in its collection of metaphors. The speaker thus resorts to negation, meaning denial. He can only say that the reaper's song is more beautiful than a nightingale's song. He cannot actually describe or capture the actual character or degree of the beauty of the reaper's song. In keeping with the first stanza's uncomfortable mix of high and low literary forms, these four lines are themselves complicated and confused. The speaker returns to the pseudo ballad form in lines 1 to 4. Like those lines, the first three lines of stanza 2 are in iambic tetrameter. Line 12 is in iambic trimeter. The rhyme scheme has shifted slightly from ABCB to ABAB, which is just a minor disruption to the standard ballad form. However, after a relatively restrained first stanza, the speaker indulges in gaudy, loud alliterations here, such as the alliteration on N in line 9. With these alliterations, meaning repetition of the same sound, the lines become self consciously literary, perhaps even pretentious. The result is a mismatch of form and content. In place of the polished, refined form, the reader might expect for a poet employing a traditional symbol of poetic beauty. Wordsworth's speaker uses a popular folk form. The conflict between the high and low, which characterize the two halves of the first stanza, has thus migrated inside the lines 9 to 12. Lines 13 to 16. A voice so thrilling never was heard in springtime from the cuckoo bird, breaking the silence of the seas among the farthest Hebrides. In lines 13 to 16, the speaker continues to search for adequate language to describe the beauty of the reaper's song. He has tried comparing the song to a nightingale in lines 9 to 12, but he finds her song more beautiful than any nightingale's song. In these lines, he tries a new metaphor, comparing her voice to that of another bird, the cuckoo. He also locates the cuckoo in a very different geographical place from the nightingale. Where the nightingale sings to exhausted travelers in the Arabian desert, the cuckoo sings in the farthest Hebrides, a group of islands off the northern coast of Scotland. The two environments are roughly opposite. The Arabian desert is a dry equatorial landscape. The Hebrides are an aquatic, subarctic seascape. Aquatic means having water. Between the two comparisons, then, the speaker encompasses much of the known world and its possibilities. Once again, however, he finds the reaper's song more beautiful, more thrilling than the cuckoo's. Across this great swath of the world, from the Arabian desert to the Arctic Ocean, there is no available metaphor with a voice more beautiful than the reaper's. The cuckoo is a less heavily meaningful bird in the tradition of Western literature than the nightingale is. The cuckoo is not, for instance, used as a symbol for poetry itself. That said, the cuckoo does not appear regularly in Western literature and myth. For example, the Greek god Zeus adopts the form of a cuckoo to seduce Hera before their marriage. So, with this comparison to a cuckoo's voice, the once again speaker tries to measure the reaper's song with an allusion to an important tradition in Western culture. And once again, the reaper's song exceeds that symbol, as the speaker notes that the cuckoo's voice was never so thrilling as the reaper's song. As with the comparison of the nightingale, the speaker seems to be insisting on the inability of the poetic symbols at his disposal to adequately describe the reaper's singing, and to more broadly be insisting that metaphor as tool fails to describe her song adequately. Once again, he is forced to describe her song through negation. He cannot say what it sounds like. He can only say that it is more thrilling than something else. As in the first stanza of the poem, the poem's form shifts in the second half of the second stanza, moving from an approximation of a ballad to an approximation of heroic couplets. The shift in form seems significant in this stanza. Neither in a ballad nor in an elevated learned form Can the speaker describe the reaper's song? All his resources as a poet fail him. The stanza is also highly enjambed. Only lines 4 and 16 are end stopped. After the contemplative, slow moving first stanza, the speaker seems to encourage the reader to speed through these lines, fittingly, since these lines fail to describe the reaper. These lines thus take on the sense of a kind of frenzied, failed attempt, with the fact of the failed attempt weighing more importantly than the precise content of those attempts. The stanza also thus issues an implicit challenge to develop new poetic resources that might do better, that could actually describe the beauty of the reaper's song. Lines 17 to 20. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far off things and battles long ago. In stanza 2, the speaker tries to describe the beauty of the reaper's song, a task he finds difficult, if not impossible, with the poetic resources at his disposal. In stanza 3, he switches tactics and tries to describe what she sings about, the content of her song. However, as he admits in line 17, he does not understand the reaper's song. He asks for someone to explain it to him. The reason for his incomprehension, meaning lack of understanding, are not immediately clear. He may simply be too far away to make out the words, with only the melody carrying down to him across the fields. More likely, she is singing in Scots, the national language of Scotland at the time. Though Scots is similar to English in many ways, it is a separate language, a language that Wordsworth didn't know. Since the speaker can't understand what the reaper sings, he begins to speculate. In lines 18 to 20, he advances one possibility. She is singing a sad song, plaintive numbers, in memory of ancient tragedies, battles, and political disasters that affected her ancestors but not her. In contrast to the specific allusions in stanza 2 to the nightingale and the cuckoo, this is an allusion to a broad tradition of heroic poetry, such as epics like the Iliad by Virgil, the ancient Greek poet, concerned with grand deeds and struggles. Virgil was a Latin poet. This is an instructive moment. Though the speaker imagines that the reaper might be concerned with politics, it is the politics of the past. In the speaker's mind, she is disconnected from the political struggles of the present, which, with the French Revolution having occurred in the recent past and Napoleon rising to power in France, were considerable and directly affected working people in the rural parts of England and Scotland. The speaker then, in observing this woman in the rural countryside, imagines her in a kind of nostalgic way. He sees her as living in or connected to a lost past and disconnected from the present. As the speaker indulges in this fantasy about the contents of the reaper's song, he switches back into an approximation of a ballad. 3 lines of iambic tetrameter followed by a line of iambic trimeter, rhymed ABAB. By now, this is the expected move in the poem. The poem has found a kind of equilibrium, a consistent pattern that emerges from its continuing internal conflicts over the proper form in which to describe the reaper's song. Lines 21 to 24. Or is it some more humble lay, familiar matter of today? Some natural sorrow, loss, or pain that has been and may be again? In lines 21 to 24, the speaker continues the work of the previous lines, trying to guess the content of the reaper's song. In lines 17 to 20, he speculated that it might concern the great battles and political tragedies of the past. In lines 21 to 24, he offers a new option. Instead of being concerned with grand historical catastrophes, she is singing about things closer at home, matters of the heart and family. In contrast to the great tragedies of history, singular monumental events, these humble familiar matters reoccur over and over again. They have been and may be again, the speaker notes. They are the constants of human life, things that don't get recorded by history, but nonetheless transcend history because they affect so many different people in so many different historical situations. The speaker thus draws an implicit opposition between the personal and the political, matters of heart and matters of state, and he projects that opposition onto the reaper's song. Where stanza 2 wrestles with the capacity of poetry to adequately reproduce the reaper's song, stanza 3 seems to accept the speaker's inability to do so. He now positions himself on the outside of the reaper's song, an observer attempting to make sense of it. This emphasizes the distance between the reaper's art and the speaker's poetry. They have separate subjects, separate languages, though perhaps they share some of the same pains. The end of the stanza follows the pattern established in previous stanzas, switching in its final 4 lines into a set of continuous iambic tetrameter couplets rhymed CCDD. Once again, there is some tension between the form of the poem and its contents. In this elegant and elevated form, the speaker describes humble everyday sorrows, the kind of pain that might be better suited for a ballad. Meanwhile, in the previous half of the stanza, that is lines 17 to 20, in which he describes high heroic events, he uses the ballad, though those events would traditionally be reserved for heroic couplets or blank verse. The poem's form continues to be a sight of struggle and conflict, the speaker and the poet wrestling to find the language and form appropriate to his subject. Lines 25 to 32. Whatever the theme the maiden sang, as if her song could have no ending, I saw her singing at her work and over the sickle bending. I listened, motionless and still, and as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. The first stanza of the Solitary Reaper introduces the reader to the scene at the center of the poem, a solitary Scottish woman cutting grain and singing. The second and third stanzas try and mostly fail to describe her song. In these 2 stanzas, in order to arrive at any kind of description, the speaker is forced to rely on negation and speculation. He is never able to directly or clearly capture the actual nature of the song. In the final stanza, the speaker retreats, returning to the work of the first stanza. He describes the scene for the reader once more. I saw her singing at her work and over the sickle bending. And he once again describes her song in broad general terms. The maiden sang as if her song could have no ending. Indeed, he seems to have given up on offering any rich description of the song. Instead, using polyptoton, he describes the song mainly by repeating words related to song insistently: sang, song, and singing. Note that this repetition in the final stanza is actually an intensification of the similar repetition of singing and sings in the first stanza. While that repetition may have passed unnoticed, this one announces itself forcefully. However, something important has changed between the first and fourth stanzas. The speaker is suddenly using the past tense to describe the scene. He is no longer speaking to the reader as though they might look over their shoulder and see the reaper at work. Instead, he confesses that he is describing an event that has already taken place, potentially some time ago, and at some distance from where he is at the time of writing this poem. In the final 4 lines of the poem, the speaker confesses that the poem actually narrates a memory, noting that the reaper's song haunted him as he walked the hill out of the valley where she was working, and continued to haunt him long after. The final stanza thus complicates some of the poem's questions. On a first read, for instance, stanza 2 may seem to be largely about whether the traditions of poetry are adequate to the task of describing the reaper's song. On a second read, this question is complicated, though not altogether displaced. One must now consider the role of memory in constructing poetry. Wordsworth famously once wrote that poetry emerges from the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. The solitary reaper answers precisely to this definition of poetry. It describes a powerful and emotive scene, but it reflects on that scene from a tranquil distance, the poet processing his experience after it has happened. The poem is thus, in a sense, a reflection on poetry itself as Wordsworth understands it. The poet is meditating throughout the poem on the capacities of his own art and its capacity to capture the powerful experiences he understands to be at its core. And he seems ultimately undecided, ambivalent about whether the poem truly can capture those experiences. The poem ends with a lingering melancholy, with the reaper's song never fully described to the reader, and remaining as something only private to the speaker, existing only in my heart. The poem and poetry more broadly can capture not the song itself, but only the way it has affected the speaker. The conflict between the speaker's goals for the poem and what the poem is actually able to achieve is expressed throughout the poem in the poem's form. That conflict continues in the fourth stanza, which follows the mixed pattern of stanza 1, rhymed A, B, C, B, D, D, E, E, with 3 lines of iambic tetrameter a line of iambic trimeter, and then 4 more lines of iambic tetrameter. This stanza, as with the 3 previous stanzas, can be divided in half. The first half, a kind of ballad stanza, followed by something like heroic couplets, two very different forms with very different cultural associations. That the poet switches between them repeatedly in the same poem suggests that neither quite accomplishes what he hopes to. Instead, he is left with some lingering feeling of complication, failure, and an implicit desire for a different, better set of poetic resources to be able to communicate what so far he has failed to capture and exists only in his heart. Now, we have the vocabulary of solitary reaper. Words, you have, in other words, the meanings of the difficult words: highland, lass, reaping, strain, veil, profound, nightingale, bands, haunt, Arabian, Hebrides, plaintive, numbers, lay, sickle. In the next session, we will look at the themes of the poem. Thank you.